Is that you, Renika?
Nah, it's me.
Oh, okay. Hi.
I think Renika is headed to the office.
Okay. How do I look?
Deva.
Okay. See how this goes.
I'm gonna start letting people in. Good afternoon, everyone. We're just giving people a few more minutes as they're trickling in. Thank you for your patience.
Hello, folks. We're just going to give people a couple more minutes to get in and join us. Thank you for being here, and we will get started soon. Thank you.
Hello, Tracy. Hello, Christopher. Thank you for being here. Good to meet you, Tracy. I think I've seen you before.
Nice to meet you too. Thank you for inviting me. I show up everywhere, I think.
You were at the Duwamish River.
Oh yeah, at the River Festival. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's up, good people? Good to see y'all.
Hello, how are you, Dr. Kanosh?
Please, Chris.
So is that the library over there?
I wish we had a critical race theory library or a critical race theory section in any of our libraries.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to manifest it somehow.
So I wanted you to meet each other. Nestor, raise your hand. So Nestor is our development manager at the Equity in Education. Everybody will introduce themselves. Tracy is with the Washington Equity now, and Chris is with the University of Washington, Tacoma Department of Education. We have all sorts of questions for you. So be ready. And I know data is not something people like to talk about, but we thought it would be great. And then let me introduce you to Renika. Renika, where are you? Oh, there. This is Renika. She will be facilitating.
Yes. Hello.
All
All right, so I think we can go ahead and get started. I am going to pass it off to our panelists to introduce themselves, and I will pass it off to Dr. Chris.
Thank you, Renika. It's nice to be here with y'all. Please call me Chris. Doctor makes me think like I'm supposed to know something. This is what we'll be talking about today. Reinforces this notion that some people know some stuff and some people don't. So we're going to challenge that. So my day job is a professor in education. I study critical race theory, racism, and the ways in which schools essentially perpetuate and foster and justify racism, sexism, heterosexism, and binaries as a normal everyday operating thing when that normal everyday operating thing is actually just a whole bunch of violence that we heap upon folks of color in particular. It's nice to be here. Am I supposed to tag the next person?
And Dr. Tracy?
I am not a doctor yet. I'm hoping to be a doctor in spring. And when I become a doctor, I will be using doctor because I am a first generation college student and I went all the way. So people better be calling me doctor. I'm the executive director of Washington Ethnic Studies now and a co-founder of Washington Ethnic Studies now. I use they, them pronouns. I identify as Chicanekis. And I'm a doctoral candidate and I'm writing my dissertation on the retention of educators of color in K through 12 urban public schools and how ethnic studies and anti-racist curriculum can play a role in that retention for educators of color. And so that's my work, ethnic studies. I dream about it, I write about it, I learn about it, all of that good stuff. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And Nestor?
Yeah, thank you for having me today. I'm also with the EEC, Equity in Education Coalition. And so, yeah, I'm here to share my experience working with data collection. My previous job, I used to work for a federal grant called ANAPISI, which is an Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander Serving Institutions grant. It's very data heavy set. And so it's a federal grant that relies heavily on data to help push issues of like Pacific Islanders and Asian Americans. And I'm just here to share my experience working with the ANAPISI grant on using data for communities of colors, and also talk about my own personal experience of using data within communities and building communities and how we can effectively decolonize data and use data for, for Indigenous and people of color. But yeah, that's me. Glad to be here.
Thank you. So to jump right into it, so yeah, we have like a list of questions. Folks who are on the call, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we will get to as many as we possibly can. And to our panelists, feel free to just jump in on these questions. I don't need to call on you, but I will if need be. So first question that we have today is, what does decolonizing data mean? Or what would decolonized data look like to you?
I could jump in. Or,
Thank you.
yeah, I can start off with this question. I think for myself as an Indigenous Samoan American, Indigenous Pacific Islander, I think for me, what you call decolonized data, what that means to me is making sure that the data that's collected and used are used by the people that are for kind of thing. Because I know for a lot of Pacific Islanders, like one of the most annoying things that happens to us is a lot of these educators or people who come and do research for Pacific Islanders come and get all these data sets, get all these data and information, and then just take it back with them and use it for their own, I guess, for their own power, for their own privilege kind of thing, for themselves, basically. And they rarely ever give back to the communities where they took these data from. They never acknowledge them. They never, say that they use them, and then it would never give anything back usually. And so I think in an effort to decolonize data, I think we need to realize that we need to recognize where we got these data from. We need to include them in that, and we need to give it back to them and let them use it for their own needs. At least that's from my perspective. But yeah, I don't want to take up too much space, but yeah, that's from my perspective.
I just want to start off by saying that true decolonization can't happen without repatriation of land to Indigenous people, and that there are various forms of decolonization. And I think it's important to state that out loud whenever we talk about decolonizing anything. We can't truly decolonize without land repatriation and reparations for other folks who, like African-American folks, Black folks, and things like that. So, but I totally agree with what Nestor said. I also think, you know, as a current PhD candidate and talking about methodologies and whatnot, there's a debate in academia about quantitative versus qualitative data. And so I think part of that decolonization has to place more value on qualitative data. I feel like quantitative data is a good measurement methodology to measure something, but for answers, for healing, which is really what decolonization is about too, is about healing, that's in the stories. That's in the lived experiences of people, right? So I feel like, especially when we're talking about education and you're talking about school districts, it's almost 100% numbers that they're talking about when they're talking about data, student data. And we need to go to the stories. And we need to stop saying that it's only about the children, because we know that educators, the racial and ethnic identity of educators, the stories and experiences of educators impact the students. So if we're not also collecting that qualitative storied experience data from educators, we're not helping students. And so that's why I focus my research on retention of educators of color, because we know educators of color have better academic outcomes for students, regardless of the racial or ethnic background of the students. So I think, I guess, part of the decolonization of data and education is thinking about community data and not just student data.
Thanks. I appreciate Nestor and Tracy both kind of situating, and I especially appreciate Tracy naming repatriation. So for me, the first part of I guess I'll echo that. If we're talking about decolonizing, for me, naming what decolonizing means. So if we're not talking about land as wealth and essentially taking land from white ownership and giving that to folks, and without like the capitalistic framing of here's what you can and cannot do with that land. If we're not talking about that, then I don't feel like we're talking about decolonization other than as a cute like word like equity or justice or something like that. That sounds cute, but doesn't actually mean anything, or that certainly doesn't mean giving back things that were stolen. Within that context, that we remain on that. So when we talk about doing that within a context of data in schools, I think about the purpose of schools are designed to colonize, and we're specifically designed to colonize Indigenous folk and force Indigenous folk into whiteness, excluded Black communities from participation, and then only through legal means, Brown versus Board of Ed, really kind of reluctantly included Black folk into that. So we talk about Pacific Islander, we talk about Asian communities, most of those were intended to be colonized, but from a lens of essentially anti-indigeneity. I feel like that our data systems just reflect that. Our data systems are designed to measure acquiescence to whiteness. So a good student is a colonized student, which means they do well in school. Well, to do well in school generally means that you do what you're supposed to do. There's of course a million exceptions. Kids are kids and kids will do what kids do within that conversation. But we reward success in schools with access to capitalism, access to wealth, right? So there's a reason why people do well. There's a reason why people send children to quote unquote good schools. But what makes a good school isn't that there's incredible teachers or incredible students. What makes a quote unquote good school by any sort of measurement that we use is parents have access to wealth, and the school is essentially well-resourced in comparison, and well-resourced to get kids to do well at capitalism. So for me, like looking at decolonizing data means recognizing that all of the official, quote unquote, official data that we collect, that we generate, that we measure is all geared towards a system of forced assimilation and whiteness that doesn't allow folks to be who they are, how they are, in the multiple languages, multiple contexts, multiple gender frames that people actually embody as who they are as people, right? So schools are designed to silence. Our data is designed to essentially document who's being silenced more effectively. Right. So for me, we have to, so I appreciate the naming of storytelling and community stories and community knowledge. That conversation is so far removed in a day-to-day level of how we even remotely think about data as a lived experience for educators in K through 12 or higher education. And I'll say this is the same parallel in healthcare, in housing. All of the languages and things that we measure are acquiescence to what we presume to be this like white binary. And most folks of color around the globe, the global majority, don't ascribe to this, but are forced into this in order to participate in capitalism. So that was enough, but.
Thank you so much. So how do we as BIPOC folks control our stories and information in decolonized data in comparison to how it may be now?
I'll take a stab at this. One thing that frustrated me when I was in a school district is that the people at the top, which were always white, usually women, would call together a diverse committee of people, exploit their experiences and collect data, and then go and interpret it through their white female lens, right? That's usually what happens. And so I'm learning more and more since I left the system, and I now run a nonprofit, that has to happen outside of the system. We can't control our stories inside the system. We don't have control of the system, so that's impossible, right? I'm sorry, I live on a busy street and there's sirens. And so I think one way for us to control it is to create our own systems, to create our own organizations where we know how to center our voices and our stories. And then we use that as a counter narrative to the systems and the data that the systems are collecting and analyzing. And we really hold them accountable and ask them, here's our data. What are you going to do with it now? I know we're here to talk about decolonizing data within the education system. I don't think that's possible because the education system is inherently a colonized system.
So I want to ask then, oh, I'm sorry, Nestor, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna add to Tracy's comment as well. I mean, I totally agree. I mean, that's one of the struggles because when I was working in community college, that was like one of the most difficult things to do when we're talking about decolonizing data, because like what you mentioned before, like they would not accept qualitative data because they said that's not accurate enough or that's not accepted. They're very like hard on numbers kind of thing. And that's a real struggle. It's part of the reason why I'm no longer in those systems and try to join something that's outside of those systems. And then, it felt like I could make more changes outside of it kind of thing. And I think to also add to this question as well, I think, if you're in those systems, it's very difficult. I mean, I've tried to be hopeful kind of thing and be like, we can try to make changes, but I think it's got to come from both ends too, because we still got to help those who are in the system as well too, because I feel for them, they're struggling, some of them don't have a choice. But at the same time, I really like this outside the system approach as well, because I think that's something that's very, very needed, especially when it comes to data, because in order for us to help ourselves, we gotta have our own people collecting our own data and owning it and knowing that we are experts in these things. Because that's the annoying thing about data, and those who collect data, they make the assumption that they are the experts and that they're the ones that know the answers. And so that's why with our communities, with those people creating their own nonprofits, their own institutions, take ownership of that power. You're an expert in your community, your own lived experiences. You might not have the words or the frameworks, but that's something that you can learn. A lot of our colonizers will never have our experience, and that's the disadvantage to them. And for us, we know what's best for our communities. I think that's why I'm very heavy advocate. The only people that can fix your own communities is if you're from those communities. And so, if we're looking for for researchers and data people, you don't have to, it'd be great if you have PhDs and all these degrees, that would help a lot. But, if you're starting, you can start, you don't have to have those degrees. You can just start that framework and start collecting those data and start using it. And then hopefully that'll lead you to more avenues and more allies that can help qualify those data as well, kind of thing. But yeah.
Velma, you had something?
Oh, lost my train of thought, but continue. Sorry.
Sorry about that.
No worries. So, and I know that Nestor has talked about this a bit just within our organization about biracial or mixed race folks getting left out of data countless times. And so how do we include biracial or mixed race identities into decolonized data, and what would that look like? And I'll call on Nestor first since you've talked about this.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, this is like part of my experience working within community colleges, and also my experience like working back in the day for recruiting for colleges. And one of the things that frustrated me a lot was like, when I was looking at data for like mixed race students, a lot of the time they'll put them in the data sets that are the ones that they check first. So if someone is Black and Pacific Islander, if they check Black first, they'll be automatically put into the Black data pool kind of thing. If you're like, mixed with something, it's usually the first one, or usually the one that they prioritize. And so that's one of my frustrations with collecting data, especially from a Pacific Islander standpoint, because Pacific Islanders are heavily mixed race. They're a race that's like mixed with so many other different ethnicities and races. And so the numbers that are shown like in the state and in schools are not really reflective of Pacific Islanders, because they are buried within that data set. They're usually, it's usually under something else. And so that's one of the things that Anna PZ and other people like are all about aggregating or disaggregating data, breaking that data even further to show that, that there's like hidden, that there are hidden values there that are not reflected in the data. And so that's why it's very important that, in like community colleges or in, or any institution that's collecting data that has mixed race, I would encourage them to evaluate how they would collect mixed race data. Because for a lot of communities or a lot of mixed race students, they're not just like for myself, I'm not just 50% Filipino, 50% Samoan. I'm 100% Samoan and 100% Filipino. Those are not something that I can just quantify with numbers kind of thing. It's like saying that, like if someone is like a father, they're also a male, and they're also a brother, those data, they're still the same. They're still 100% fathers. They're still 100% brothers kind of thing. And so I think that's how we should reimagine how we should collect data, instead of using it as numbers like that, but use them as like intersectional categories kind of thing. And so that's why I brought that question up too.
I hella appreciate you naming intersectionality. So critical race theory based term around recognizing that humans are multifaceted and have multiple identities and are oppressed, specifically because folks are intersectional and representing multiple oppressed identities within that. And also the language. Our language reinforce, we're using English language. It's a colonial language designed to oppress as well. So our language specifically reinforces this binary. Biracial by definition means it doesn't mean two races. It doesn't mean an end. It's a half, right? So even when we use terminology, everyday terminology, completely devalues what Nestor named as people are end, right? So what we're coming to some sort of terms with around multiple gender identities, we still are sort of not really there with multiraciality. So I think people are adapting and pushing individually, but our data systems are designed to oppress people, right? So even when we advocate for disaggregating data, what we ultimately are enabling is universities, colleges, K-12 to more effectively measure the oppression of specific, more targeted groups, right? So while I'm not saying it's not helpful to know actual numbers, that's not how universities, colleges, K-12 use these data, right? Our public systems use these data to essentially say, look how diverse we are. And so we can continue the oppression. And look how many people, if we go back to the purpose of schools, we are effectively colonizing this many Samoan students or this many fill in the blank students, right? Like I feel like the language, our language has to shift to recognizing what this data is used for and why versus claiming or somehow representing identity out of a system. When we look towards a system designed to oppress us as the space to frame our identity, I feel like we've already lost the battle. When our identity, don't look towards white oppressive systems to determine how you should identify. That, right, that is an explicitly oppressive thing, intentionally oppressive thing in that context, right? So the lingering piece for me is like, who gets to tell whose stories? And how do we shift from thinking about collecting people's stories, because that's a very research-based colonial framework, and honoring and honoring and accelerating people's voices, so that we think about the purpose of schools as helping people tell their stories, as helping people think about and developing strength in talking about who they are, how they are, and whatever language is. Those aren't things that we collect. Knowledge isn't something to collect. That's a very Western, like, colonial construct, right? So data, then the purpose of that shifts from a colonial tool to wait. We are now actually in community talking about people's individual and collective struggles. That's a different conversation that requires, I think Tracy named it, like this deeper sense of listening that districts aren't designed to do, that all of these institutions aren't designed to do. But at some point we have to move away from, I think, like calculating the types of what kinds of identities we need to know about, and shifting that into how do we address systemic oppression, and how do people with lived experience around oppression lead those conversations through expressing who they are and how they are.
Yeah, I'm also mixed race, and a lot of times, well, I want to start off by quoting Ijeoma Oluo and say mixed race is not a race. So there's that. And I also had a school board member ask me, isn't it harder for you as a mixed race person? And I'm like, it's not harder, like it's different. It's a different experience, right? As a mixed race person, you have to kind of, like Nestor was saying, you're often forced into picking one or the other. And then also there, you know, a lot of people assume that mixed race means mixed with white, and that's not always true. And so when you aggregate the data under mixed race, you know, you're including people who aren't mixed at all with white with people who are mixed with white, right? And people who are mixed with white usually, but not always, have a proximity to whiteness that allows them greater access to resources and opportunities, right? And so if you're not disaggregating that data, you're not accurately measuring that, who has greater privileges and advantages than who doesn't. And then I also think, you know, the checking a box is so problematic. It's so, like, when I have to check a box because, you know, Mexican American or Latinx isn't considered a race, but I don't identify as either of those. I identify as Chicanekis. And so when I have to check a box, I check American Indian and white, right? Because we are American Indian. We're just below the colonized border. That's all. We're still indigenous to Turtle Island, right? So I check American Indian, even though that's not what they're looking for, I still check it, right? So I think if we decolonize data of mixed race people, we'd see the beautiful diversity that really exists. We're covering up, we're masking the beautiful diversity that exists. So I think to decolonize data for mixed race people, we need to get rid of the boxes and let people self-identify.
How do we kind of jumping around just a little bit, how do we include LGBTQ plus folks into decolonized data? And again, like how would that work? How would that look like?
I can start with this one as well too. I know the LGBTQ term, like decolonizing data, in there as well. I think even the term LGBTQ needs to be decolonized as well, because I know for a lot of indigenous and Native folks is that, there's like here in the US, there's a very Western way of looking at what is considered LGBTQ. And so when we're working to decolonize that, I think people need to understand that, there's one, like US people view LGBTQ one way, and the indigenous people view LGBTQ a different way. And depending on what country or nation or ethnicity or race you're from, LGBTQ is very defined very, very differently. And it's very, very fluid. And I know people are already frustrated that LGBTQ is just a long term, and then throwing in that very fluid frustrates so many people. But I think that's the point of decolonizing. It's like, people were not put in boxes. We're not put in, we weren't bordered up. We were very fluid, going back and forth, going, all over the place kind of thing. And so that's the same with our identities, our sexuality, our gender, and things like that. And I think that's the issue with colonization, is they're always trying to simplify things in a way that makes it easier to put them in a box, to label, and to, pump out, make things easier for them to work with, easier to control kind of thing. So that's how it works.
I don't have anything to add to that. I just really appreciate that it's fluid and it's a spectrum. And more, the more work I do, the more research, the more like contemplating and reflection I do, the more I'm seeing race and ethnicity that way too. It's a spectrum and it's fluid, right? And I really appreciate the work of Michael Dominguez in the book, Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies. And he talks about how identity and culture and race and ethnicity even shift over time, depending on socioeconomic and cultural pressures, right? And much like the way queer identity has shifted and changed it over time. And so I think you can't, I feel like I'm rambling, but you can't decolonize data if you don't see it that way. And that goes for the LGBTQ spectrum and the racial and ethnic identity spectrum.
Yeah, I just echo, like, the purpose of collecting data is to colonize people. So why we do not allow people to not, like, the idea of being fluid is, that's way more complicated to colonize. Like, but how do I need that box in order to colonize you? And we need to be able to say we are this kind of institution because we have X number of students that identify as these things. We can't do that, which means institutions can no longer celebrate being quote unquote diversity, equity, and inclusion, all these like false narratives around that, right? Like when we take back like identity as this fluid, multifaceted thing that really only the institutions only care about as an oppressive lens, right? Which is the reason why people struggle being multifaceted and recognize their own fluidity anyway, because we silence people in that, right? Violently. At some point we have to just be like, nah, we're not actually participating in that. You cannot force me to do this gender box thing that is, a little better because you kind of put some other boxes in there. And Nestor named this earlier, we got to navigate, right? People still need to eat. People still need to work within capitalism because people still need to eat. But our goal is to transform all this, not to like eat within this capitalistic society, right? So part of that has to be pushing back every opportunity we get. We're like, this is a false narrative. I'm not picking male, female, and then this other little box. And I'm not really advocating that you make that other box 27 things either. I'm arguing that our identity cannot be constricted, like limited to what these systems need, so that they can essentially keep those binaries intact, right? Like, so the conversation I think has to go deeper than, I'm not arguing we're limiting it to this, but as a national and local level, we have to go deeper than like, how do we create more boxes, right? But instead, why are we even allowing institutions to collect this sort of data so that they can then oppress different communities in specific ways?
Simi, I saw that you dropped a question in the chat. I wanted to touch back on that. Did you want to ask your question?
Thank you, Renika. Yeah, I really appreciate this forum. Yeah, I know that for a very long time, since the inception and genesis of the census, I feel like they really skewed our data and our identities up because, of course, it's just a checkbox. But then, like Nestor was talking earlier about mixed race and all of you as well, but Middle Eastern is considered white under the federal census. And so my thing is that's going to skew so much of the resources that goes down to communities because it's all now going up to this white like conglomerate race. And so I'm wondering, like, do you have any ideas how, I mean, of course, we know we kind of know the impact pro and con, but how do we utilize that to really collectively like have a data decolonization effort around what's happening there?
I'll jump in on this and my homies jump in when you want to, right? I mean, white is we do the same thing with Black. We do the same thing with Asian, right? These are like vague categories that don't reflect. Asian is my favorite one because we literally catalog 75% of the people on the planet under Asian, right? Including people that quote unquote Asian countries have colonized, right? So what? And white, to me, if we look at the historical way in which the census has classified different groups of people, allowing people white status is essentially a colonial tool to be like, come on over to our side. Please come on over here. Right, exactly, right. Latinx communities are also framed. I mean, that's Tracy named it. That's why Latinx communities are not actually framed as like a race, right? Race is a social construct used to colonize people, right? And used to essentially create ongoing like racial battles, which we do very well in the support of like white supremacy. So the United States has committed for a long time, especially through the creation of Israel, to essentially like enforce Middle Eastern people to become Christian white notion of like, right, control, essentially. That's the effort. So, there's a whole bunch of people, I mean, even naming it the Middle East, it's Middle East compared to what homeland, right? So where are people from? Well, most people are from what we call the Middle East. That doesn't even make any sense that there's a tagline like that, right? This is all so Eurocentric and trying to make it so that a specific like population of people who don't fit under that category are essentially acquiesced into the land of whiteness, right? And do what they're told.
Yeah, people who are Middle Eastern technically are either African or Asian, right? And so Middle Eastern was made up to add power to whiteness, like Chris was saying, like so that they could bolster their numbers and say, well, these folks are white. And it's not accidental, there is historical context. I think it was Samuel Morton who called Egyptians accidentally Black, right? Because so many Europeans had traded and conducted commerce and stolen ideas from Egyptians. And so they couldn't consider them African. Otherwise that would, go against all the things they were saying about how white people were morally and intellectually superior to Africans. So he classified them as accidentally Black. So there's some historical context there when we talk about that. And then on the census, is it Latinx now? Because it's been Hispanic forever, which Hispanic includes Europeans. Like how many times have I had to check somebody from Spain calling themselves Latinx and calling themselves a person of color? No, you're European. Like your people colonized and murdered my people, right? So I just think it's all, and we're starting to see, I'll be really surprised if we don't see another shift of especially light-skinned Latinx folks moving it fully into whiteness, because they're already trying. One of the leaders of the Proud Boys is a Latinx man, a light-skinned Latinx man. We're also seeing that with light-skinned Asian folks. There's a whole group on the east side of Washington of Chinese immigrants who are fighting against racial equity. There's a person running for the Bellevue School District right now fighting racial equity who's an Asian American person who quoted the bell curve saying that, Latinx and Black students just have lower IQ, so why are we even trying to get equity in schools, right? So I think we're seeing a shift in whiteness. And then there's also the people who are fighting against that classification on the census. And now her name is escaping me, but she didn't get it in on the last census. She wanted to change it from Middle Eastern to something else. And now I don't remember the acronym that she used. So there are folks who are fighting to not be classified as white on the census. But again, I don't think we can decolonize the census. It's inherently colonized. So.
And I also want to build up on what Tracy and Chris says, like, you know, this label of like whiteness too, is like a play on power. And it's like a play, like, and it's also using political power as well. For a lot of communities, like, you know, white people use it to their advantage, and then communities of colors also use it to their advantage as well. And that's how the idea of the Asian minority myth began as well, is because, you know, back in the day, you know, Asian Americans wanted to find an advantage in America. And so they created this myth, this Asian model minority myth, to help prop up their race. And, you know, I share that to show that, you know, that people of color are not always good or not always helpful in the situation, but we need to understand that they're always trying to survive. And that's one of the survival methods that's been done. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with that as well, because, you know, people always will try to survive, kind of thing. And that's something that we gotta accept. But I also want to make sure that people understand that these are the different methods that are used. And like back in the day, all brown people were considered Black, you know, way back in the day, we're all Black. They weren't differentiating it. They weren't whatever, you know, until like, you know, until they're Irish people all of a sudden, you know, became white. Jewish people became white. Like all of those were considered Black back in the day as well too. And then you can see, and I'm glad, Tracy, you're mentioning the shift in whiteness too, because that is something that as data people, as collectors, especially with collecting data on like ethnicities and race, like seeing the shift in those categories as well is very, very important, especially if you're trying to talk about decolonizing data, because colonial data, they think that everything's always set in stone. But, you know, in an attempt to decolonize data, we got to realize that in the real world, things shift all the time and things are very fluid all the time. And so I'm glad you brought that up, because, you know, whiteness is shifting right now too. Like people are trying to use that to their advantage. And I think as someone who needs to be conscious about that, you know, especially on seeing where those powers are being played, we need to be aware of how that is being used. And if it's used to like disadvantage other communities, or if it's being used to help other communities. And I think as someone who's collecting data or trying to use data for community, that is something that we should always be conscious about.
So, oh, sorry, Chris, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I mean, love Nestor's name in that. Like, I often use the term people of whiteness, which I think reflects Tracy's point, is that includes people of color who are aspirational to oppress white, like all other folks of color, right? So what whiteness being an identity versus, right, like whatever white means within that conversation. So I want to say in some ways less political and more like, yeah, you could go try to be a person of whiteness over there as well. That's a shorthand for white supremacist within that conversation, somebody who's actually committed to sustaining the way in which we oppress folks, right? And I want to recognize that Samet also named, I feel like this is it connects to our conversation. But Renika, this made you so jump in if this is a different question, but I feel like Samet's, so shout out to Maven, Matt Kelly and Maria Root, Dr. Root, who were doing some of this work a long time ago to essentially expand the boxes that we're talking about. I feel like we wouldn't be here without these kinds of conversations previously, without folks already in the struggle doing some heavy lifting. And yet our role, I feel like, is always to carry forward from I don't want to say ancestors, but these are people the same age. So right, but carrying the work forward from folks who have been pushing 20, 30, 40, 50, 70 years ago, that being counted mattered in a different way than it does now. I feel like we have a deeper level conversation around what being counted actually means. So the federal government is designed to fuck up our it's not designed to fuck up the data, it's designed to oppress through this data, right? So resources are going to be distributed unequally. We don't measure unequal distribution of resources. We measure the outcomes of unequal distribution of resources, right? So we can shift the way in which we measure the unequal distribution of resources. But I feel like that's actually a local level conversation and not a national level conversation. If we don't essentially look at what happens and document from the perspective of communities of color, how resources are unequally distributed, the national level conversation becomes a theory, becomes about census and that sort of thing. But I'm like, but there's lived like gentrification is real and lived in specific communities. Those are things that we can engage much more tangibly than I think the national level, which is, I feel like, a more political, like, can we get included in that box? Yes, that's a navigational strategy. So yes, but also if that's our battle, then we're not actually decolonizing.
Sumait, does that answer your question, or did you have anything that you wanted to add on to that before we moved on?
No, I think totally, like, we got to do it locally. I mean, I think it's going to be have to be recursive, and I love this conversation. I really appreciate everyone's input. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Talking a little bit more about the census before we move forward, is are large data sets like the census, for example, inherently colonized? And I feel like we've gone over that quite a bit, but can they even be decolonized? And if so, how?
I'm kind of looking at Tracy at this too, because like, I agree with you. Like, this is the system. This is the colonizers that we're essentially trying to decolonize. And, and it's like, I don't think, like, I'm trying to be hopeful. Like, I don't think it's impossible, but I know it's extremely difficult. And I feel like it's easier to do it outside. But at the same time, what I struggle with is that the census has a lot to do with like money and power as well. And so that's my struggle. And that's why we still need to do some sort of work into it, because it affects so many people. And that's why it's very important to try to disaggregate and make those data to disaggregate or aggregate, to make those data as accurate as possible, I think. And I think that's why we need to include, coming from both fronts, one from within the institution and one from outside of the institutions. Those of you who are already working in institutions, try to push, that data is a lot more complicated, that qualitative data is okay, that, that there's different types of labels out there, and it's okay to learn all of them. I mean, back in the day, school wasn't free to everyone, but now it is. And so, things like that, like making it seem like it's not impossible to change kind of thing. And I think changing that narrative, like, oh, there's not enough data, so we're not gonna help them at all. Because I think that's the reason why people are pushing for the census, because it's like, especially Pacific Islanders, we're always faced with this question kind of thing, oh, there's not enough data for you all, so we can't provide funding or money for you kind of thing. And that frustrates a lot of people in the Pacific Islander communities, because I'm like, well, there's no data because no one wants to do it, or the data that we collected is not, valid for you kind of thing. And so that's why there's this huge push for the census, because for a lot of Pacific Islanders, we're not on the table until we were in the census, basically. And so that's my struggle with the census. Like, I know it's very difficult to decolonize that's already from the colonizer, but at the same time, there's so much at stake there that I just can't sit back and do nothing. But that's why I really push for to coming in from both fronts, like within and from without the institutions.
Yeah, I would say I like what Chris said, the false narratives of DEI. I talk about that a lot. So in order to decolonize large data sets like the census, some people might say, well, we just need more people of color collecting and analyzing data, but that's not enough. Inclusion is a false narrative, because we tend to only include people who are colonized and who push the colonizers' agenda. So there needs to be more people of color leading, collecting, and analyzing the data. And we need to shift the purpose, because like Chris and Nestor have both said, it's about capitalism. It's about further oppressing people. And I've already talked about how decolonization also needs to be restoration of harm and healing, right? So are we collecting data to help people, to restore justice? So it's not just about who's collecting the data, it's how we're collecting it, it's why we're collecting it, it's what we're doing with it after. Like, all of those things need to be shifted. So inclusion isn't enough, equity isn't enough, diversity isn't enough. Like, it's about justice, it's about reparations. So yeah, I'm not as hopeful as Nestor. I still don't, I still don't think it's possible. Unless we go back to like total land repatriation and people just have control over their own destinies and their sense of what success is and purpose. So yeah.
I feel like Tracy just like softly spoke a solution. So I'm like, wait, right? Echo that last part. I was like, say that again, Tracy.
What, like land repatriation?
And measurement connected to that, right? Like, what does it look like if when we're thinking about what we know is rooted in land, all of a sudden we're shifting the kind of knowledge that we're talking about, right? And then who gets to speak? Because a whole lot of folks are like, I don't even know what you're talking about. It's like, great, then you probably shouldn't be talking right now, much less measuring any of this.
No, but that whole, oh, I'm sorry. That whole census idea also has a lot to do with what we're talking about in terms of land. It's redistricting. It's about trying to figure out which people are going to be in what district. And it's also a power grab. And that's how I see the census, because having experienced the fact that my district got redrawn to include a more whiter district, we lost some of the people of color that, you know, normally participates or normally were part of our district. So it's really goes back to what all of you are saying, this whole issue of land grab and repatriation. And really, it's political power.
I mean, we design congressional districts and around school districts. These are all linked, right? This is all stealing land, removing people, putting people like structurally in places that literally do not count as voting. And this is all done when we structured Black people to be 3/5 of a person, right? So we have literally structured regional, draw these all, you know, land, like states, counties, cities, all of these are designed as colonial tools to manage folks, right? And to keep quote unquote landowners white and white centric within that conversation, right? So I feel like redistricting is the exact same conversation. We still redline, so how are we going to talk about redistricting? Like that doesn't even make any sense unless we deal with like who actually gets the wealth of all of these different properties that are, how much is the cost to get a house in here, right? In Seattle, in Pacific Northwest, it's ridiculous, right? But who gets that money? Whose wealth, or every time a house value goes up, whose wealth, right? That's all connected to redistricting. So I feel like it's like redistricting to me is these are interwoven with the census, but it's sort of a false conversation, because unless we change ownership, going back to Tracy opened with this, right? Unless we change who owns land and who actually owns the wealth of land, redistricting is going, we're not going to make it. Even if we go back to like, okay, well, let's include more people of color in this one area, right? That's not going to, that's the inclusion model. That's still not going to address who owns land and who rightfully owns which land, right? This is hot, y'all.
Sorry, I had a quick Wi-Fi issue, so if I cut you off, I apologize. It glitched on my end. So I wanted to go back and talk about kind of like data within the classroom. And so we know that standardized tests are biased. Is there a decolonized way to make sure that we know how BIPAC students are faring in our educational system? And I know that we've talked about as an organization, and I know that Tracy has mentioned that it's kind of hard to decolonize data within a colonized system. How do we get somewhere close? How do we do better within the system that we're working with for our BIPOC students in regards to data and standardized tests?
Stop doing standardized tests. There's also YPAR. which I'm learning more and more about, which is a good model, is the youth participatory action research. Vincent Perez is doing a lot of that work. In my organization, we have our executive board because we have to by law because we're a nonprofit, but we also have a youth advisory board. And we capped it, like they have to be under 21. And they had the same equal voting rights as our executive board. So I think that's important in school districts. I know some school districts are moving to have student representation on the board. Unfortunately, they don't have voting rights because of legal issues. And so that goes back to like, how can you there's so many layers of colonization. But I think to do better by our students, like it's really simple. You just listen to them and then do what they tell you. That's what I always tell my youth advisory board members is I'm only here by privilege and I've created this space, but I need you all to tell me what to do and then I'll go do it, right? Like that's my job. You tell me what to do and I will go do it. But unfortunately, adults have positioned themselves as the experts and they really just need to take orders from students.
I mean, I said this earlier, but standardized tests are measuring acquiescence to whiteness and like the students' ability to be controlled. Right now, of course, not every student who tests well on standardized tests is submitting to control, but that's what we're measuring. That's what standardized tests are designed to do. So the purpose is a colonial, sinister intent. The companies that own standardized tests are linked to publishers who are linked to teacher training programs, who are linked to, right? So Tracy's point, this is all so interwoven and interconnected all around capitalism and making money off of students. So when we appoint students to advisory boards and whatnot, how can that not be an inclusion tactic? Because we literally have laws to take away students' voice. So to me, I'm like, not only we have to stop standardized testing, I'm like, we have to stop measuring kids. Like stop measuring what we think kids are supposed to be learning. That, like, what kind of world do we live in where we're like, no, I want you to learn these things and these things only, and then express your learning in these concrete ways. I'm like, that's not the world I want. Like the world I want is where kids are they know who they are, they know how they are, they can express their like personal communities, they know what's happening that's like negatively impacting their personal communities, and they know how to address that. I'm like, that's not really measurable. What's measurable is like, are they having a social impact? And I feel like we can change that notion of what are we measuring? Are things getting better in the lives of students and specific students? And students can tell us that, to Tracy's point. Like students know what's fucked up and what's not. Like you don't have to, all you have to do is ask and then be quiet. That be quiet part is apparently something that adults have a hard time with.
I totally agree with Tracy and Chris. I mean, this whole issue of standardized testing is like a hot mess, and it really should be done with. Like it frustrates me that still goes on to this day. I mean, like from my own personal experience, like I guess my little story time is like when I first took my first standardized testing, I grew up in American Samoa, which is a territory of the US. And the test was called an Iowa test. And I was taking it in Samoa. And the questions they were asking me were like, if you walk 2 blocks and you turn right at this library, whatever, something like that. And then, but in my head, like I grew up in an island and I have no idea what the hell a block is. And we didn't have a library. And I was like being measured on these things. I'm like, what the hell is this supposed to mean? And they were talking about people that I had no idea what they were about and things like that. And I'm like, and these are what they're grading students on things that have no clue or no control over, kind of thing. And they're expecting that to be an accurate representation of how smart they are or a factor for how well they succeed in life. And it's very, very inaccurate. And it's a very, very bad way to collect data on people, kind of thing. And I feel like, it's Chris and Tracy are saying, like, it has a lot to do with money and power, because those standardized test people are like heavily instituted in education, and they made it where they made laws and stuff that make it where that they have to do standardized testing. And I feel like the system's not going to change itself. The system is naturally just going to do what it's going to keep doing, unless someone throws something at it or do something. then it will hopefully change and hopefully in the right direction too. But yeah.
Not only that, but you have to be vigilant. So one of my colleagues just said, you know, white supremacy, which was what we're talking about in a system, is fluid and it'll fill any vessel you put it in. So once we change something, it'll come back and morph itself. And another friend of mine calls it rewriting, the rewriting process. And so we can't just like say, okay, we achieved this, yay, right? We have to be vigilant. We have to stay on it because it's going to respond in kind, right? And so we have to hold the system and the folks that are operating the system accountable. Otherwise, they're just going to go right back to where they were before.
Yeah, I think about decolonizing as a permanent thing, right? So anti-racism is like, there aren't people who are anti-racist. There's people who are committed to anti-racism, right? Like these are everyday ongoing battles and struggles, like internally and then collectively. We're not going to be decolonized. Decolonizing is an ongoing process, right? Because white supremacy is going to keep on fighting and battling, and all of our infrastructures, to Tracy and Nestor's point, all of our infrastructures are woven through white supremacy. So even when we do well within these institutions, we're just reinforcing white supremacy, even if you personally are not, right? We're still used in that kind of way. Nestor, I like that you said something about throwing stuff. I sort of feel like we can't like at some point, like the institutions are, so critical race theory uses interest convergence, right? Like any sort of, I think there's all communities have words in which we talk about rewhitening, right? Coloniality being, maintaining racism, all of these things are self-correcting. And they self-correct, all these systems self-correct because we reward people for being oppressive, right? The more oppressive you are, the higher you get to move in bureaucracies. As long as you do it nicely and with the DEI language, you can pretty much like just keep talking about how great it is because we are collectively supporting and how good we're doing because our standardized tests are good. We admit the best students. We only hire the best students. However you want to frame that. All of this, like we still celebrate when somebody gets into an elite university. I would argue in most of the communities I move within, and I'm like, what does that mean when we celebrate somebody getting into Harvard versus UW or UW versus community college? When we celebrate that, we're reinforcing all of this, right? Because what do you learn in these institutions? We already know, right? So part of it is we also have to like continually challenge ourselves to be like, don't keep putting value in things that are, the value is in their coloniality, right? But we're colonizing that in part because like this, I think we said repeatedly, like we still have to navigate. But how comfortably do we have to navigate?
So like test scores are used as weapons against us, y'all. Like it's weaponized against us. And going back to the conversation about mixed race students, I have proximity to whiteness because my mother is white. And so I scored higher on those tests and I was identified as gifted. And that is being used as a weapon against my people, right? It's being used as a weapon against other Chicanx people. Well, look, she did it. Yeah, because I had advantages and privileges that my peers didn't, right? But they use that against us. And it's not even about race. I'm an atheist and my kids grew up atheists. And one of the questions on the test was, what is sin? And my kids came home and they're like, Mom, what's sin? Like, I don't even know. It's used against neurodivergent people. I have a student who has multiple intersecting, like my own biological child, multiple intersecting learning disabilities and emotional disabilities. And it's used against those people too, right? Like they're not full human beings if they can't pass these horrible, horrible tests. It's not only harmful for the people taking them, it's harmful for all of us, even white folks. It's harmful for everybody.
So going off of what you just said, what was just talked about kind of using this data against us, how do we balance using data to keep track of the inequities that our students are facing, while also ensuring that these inequities aren't then turned around and used against us, furthering, against our students who are furthest from any type of educational justice, as is right now?
I'll jump in first. So I think about two things. One is, so we have to stop measuring progress or doing well within standardized frame of school, right? So one was we have to totally get rid of it, just to Tracy's word, stop, period, done with that. And I feel like the second part is, how are we measuring, so I have a three-part answer. Second part is like, how are we measuring how we socially invest in educational systems? So social investment, meaning in predominantly white areas, the tax value is higher. There's policy ways in which more funding goes to such schools, which means there's more teachers, which means there's more resources and people who need those resources less. There's ways in which we can do indices. There's a number of researchers who do social investment indices around essentially who is well resourced to do well versus communities that we don't resource, that we know we don't resource, that are reliant upon essentially a district funding versus all this other money that comes in, all these other grants, all these other right sources. And that's money. We do the same thing with housing, do the same thing with healthcare, all these things. Rather than look at who has needs, quote unquote, it's like, let's actually look at how we're resourcing whom, and how our resources are designed to support people who already have resources, right? And the third part is then change, like, what do communities want children to be learning in school? What do children want to be learning in school? And how does that, and then how do we start measuring that? That conversation shifts from school districts saying, let's bring together a handful of community leaders. It's like, actually, school district, you're not part of this. This is a community-driven model of, right? And I think this connects with reparations and land repatriation. Who gets to determine what the purpose of school is? And I feel like we had this wonderful opportunity. If you told me last year we were going to shut down schools for a year, I feel like it would have been great to stop school entirely and bring everybody together and be like, okay, now let's actually think about why we're here and what we're trying to do. So I'm like, let's pause the measurement conversation. Let's come back to, why do we have school? What's the purpose? Who should be leading it? Whatever the it is, right? How can community-based organizations be central in that conversation? Multiple communities be central in that conversation and leading it along with students and children, right? Reframe what the purpose of schooling is, and then we can start talking about students as measurements, right? But I'm like, I don't even know if I don't know that will even come up.
I think there's better data to look at too. Like, I don't want to come in here and say all data is bad. Data is important. Data are important. But if we look at attendance, if we look at graduation rates, if we look at the student climate survey data, and then also collecting those stories from students, right? Because even the student climate survey data, we ask the wrong questions, right? Because it's white men usually designing the surveys. I think we can look at that data and have a much better picture of where students are than standardized testing. Even if we use the flawed tools to collect the data, it's still better than standardized testing. I was gonna say something else, but I forgot. I just really wanna talk about the importance of the stories and the data, because as one of the few educators of color in my school, I taught 6th grade, who specifically taught about race. My students of color felt comfortable coming to me and telling me their stories and telling me their trauma and their pain that they're experiencing in other people's classrooms. So if we can just do that, like talk to kids and make a safe space for them to share how they are and what they're getting and what they're not getting from their students, like, I just don't understand why that's not already a thing. Like, I like, logistically, I know why, but why are we having these conversations? Oh my gosh, what should we do? Well, listen, like, just listen, love your students and listen to them. Like, I don't understand why that's so hard.
I also want to build off on what Chris said earlier too, of like, you know, the issue of like why we are collecting this data. Because I think that's like another important thing. Like we're all in this mindset that we need to collect as much data as possible for every little thing. And what ends up happening is like all those data just like sits somewhere on a desk or sits somewhere not even being used at all. But we got to be very intentional of why we're collecting it as well and what we're going to be using it for, kind of thing. And I just wanted to push on that issue as well. Like, you know, we can like intentional data collecting for good kind of thing, you know, for decolonizing. And that's why I appreciate Tracy's like story, like, you know, qualitative data is such an important thing. And that's what our communities have been doing for the beginning of time, you know, qualitative data. We just collected it, recorded it, and passed it along very differently from what Westerners have done. And so we need to shift those values, what is valued in data, you know, to what our own values are. And, you know, that's why I'm very, you know, and that's why I'm pushing, like, why are you collecting these data? How are you collecting it, and what are you using it for? You know, and that's why I want to push that kind of thing. Because, you know, Tracy, like, the colonial methods are harmful. You know, that's a fact. You know, and we must try, you know, to find other ways of collecting it and more appropriate ways for our communities of collecting it. And, you know, hopefully coming from our own selves as well.
And what are you doing with it is really important too. And this is why I want to also focus on data from educators that we need to collect. Because let's say, you know, typically you have a subgroup of students whose attendance is low. We're using attendance as a measurement, right? A data point. And so what we do is we go out into the community and try to figure out how to get those kids and families into the school instead of looking at us and figuring out why kids don't want to come to our classrooms, right? So that's why we need to also collect data on educators, including like educators who send too many referrals for discipline, educators who send too many referrals for special education, because the students, again, if you listen to the students, they will tell you which teachers are racist. You just have to ask them. They know, right? This teacher needs help with this. And they'll tell you exactly what that teacher needs help with. 12-year-olds can tell you. So yeah, it's important to also be collecting that data for educators.
Sorry, Tracy just reminded me, like, I forgot who said this quote, but then, but I think it was an indigenous person. I'll look it up if I have a chance, but they're saying, like, people are always coming to our communities looking for problems, you know, collecting data for problems, and they search for the problem communities, but they never come to our communities looking for solutions. And so I feel like, you know, you need to change that mindset. Our communities have these solutions. And so, you know, you come to our communities for solutions, don't come to us for problems, kind of thing.
So I wanted to open up the conversation to our panelists. If y'all have anything else that you would like to add or discuss that we might not have covered in our questions in this conversation. Also want to open it up to folks in attendance. If you have any questions, please feel free to either drop them in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
So I'm sorry that she has already left, but one of the participants had actually wanted to know, you know, when you talk about data, there's also an issue of racism when we don't collect the right data for those who speak multiple languages or languages other than English. And I think that we're always struggling with this in the nonprofit world, because we're supposed to provide information to our communities, but they're not translated into the languages. And some of our communities, particularly some of the elders, don't have the, how do you say, you know, the reading ability, even if it's in their own language. You can talk to them, but, you know, and even if you translate it, you need to translate it colloquially rather than the formal way. So she was wanting to know if there's any kind of like data that has been taken that tells the story about the people from different countries and different, you know, languages, who speak different languages. Because that also impacts education of the student.
I think Tracy and Nessa are both named kind of qualitative methods that are way more that can be way more tailored to specific communities, linguistic communities, whichever kind of community. But we don't think of qualitative data as at the systems level as valid data, right? So not just in doc programs and that sort of thing, but at any of these institutions, we kind of devalue that, which I think reinforces Nessa's point about like communities being considered too small to count. It's the same, right? Like we consider stories too irrelevant or too anecdotal, whatever the dismissive thing that we want to say is, to count, right? Versus some fictive notion of let me like calculate what I think matters. And Velma, you said something that I think is super important. If we're measuring something that we can't communicate to somebody, that's not worth measuring. If you can't communicate it to somebody, then why are you measuring that? Like, is that really, like, I feel like that's a beautiful red flag to be like, maybe this is not the right thing to be asking. Since this person can't understand what I'm saying, that's probably because I'm the one who doesn't make any sense, right? Especially if you're trying to talk to somebody in their home or are you trying to go into a community, not in a school thing, and try to talk to somebody, you don't know how to ask it. I'm like, you probably shouldn't even be there.
This is something I struggle with too, because even I identify as Chicanekis and I am monolingual. It takes an inordinate amount of time and resources to meet the needs of everybody. And so it's easier to just be like, oh, well, I tried my best. I reached all the people that I could. So I don't have an answer for that. When you find one, please share it with me because I am also working on that. And you ask for volunteers, especially as a nonprofit. But I feel like for systems, there's no excuse. Like systems, like SPS is $1 billion budget now or something like that, right? Like, why aren't they using some of that? And why aren't they sharing it with smaller districts who can't afford it? So yeah, I don't know. There's got to be some kind of community effort behind that. And also where people, if we're bringing in those elders to do the translating in the colloquial language that you're talking about, Velma, are we compensating them for their time too, right? Because too many times we're expecting people to do it for free.
For free, especially, in our communities, the people of color communities are expected to do all these things for free.
Yeah, and I think that question also, asked on a deeper level as well. And that's also an issue. One of the issues I wanted to bring up as well is like, what value, do we value that data? Does the institution value that data? Because, data on like, race, ethnicity, and things like that are not very valued in the American institution. But when it comes to like sports, football, they like have so much data, of everything. They calculate how much food they eat, how often they work out to the individual, like to the whatever. But we can't even do that for our own students, for our own schools and things like that. And I wanted to talk about that issue of like, we have systems and institutions that have this enormous amount of resources to calculate data, to bring useful data, to improve physical bodies of these athletes, of these people, of like stocks and all these things. But yet we will not throw a single penny towards, on issues like race, ethnicity, decolonization, and things like that. And that's why, where does these institutions put value in those data, kind of thing?
Do folks have any other questions or comments? Well, on that note, I want to say thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us today and giving some amazing insight and answering all of our pretty tough questions. So that is greatly appreciated. If folks, we have our next Lunch and Learn coming up in a couple weeks, and that will be on decolonizing disability studies. Again, this is part of our Decolonizing Education series leading up to our Decolonizing Education Conference that will be held November 3rd the 5th, and we have moved to a virtual platform. If you have not been made aware of that, just with the rise in COVID cases, we want to do what is best, not only for our team, but for our attendees. I will drop the link to our conference website in the chat. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or send a message through our conference website or email our conference email. It's all going to be me. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And again, can't thank you enough to our panelists for being here and everybody on the call. And with
Renika,
that, yes.
somebody was asking about the recording of this session. I know
Yes.
that we recorded.
So the recording, I can also drop this in the chat. The recording of this session will be dropped onto our YouTube channel. I just dropped our YouTube channel link in the chat, and we should have that up, I would say, within the next 24 hours. And Sumit.
Oh, thank you, Renika. I'm sorry, I do have a question since we were on the what is it? The topic of I forgot what you were talking about, but maybe this will bring it back. Sorry, I'm not on my meds today. But let's see.
It's the languages.
That, yes, and then the thing is, okay, so how do we actually, like, you know how funders are asking you for data, like they're giving $50,000 and they're like, oh, you know, can we get a report on blah 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 blah? Like, what's the best response to let them know that fuck you, you don't need our data, but give us the money and just trust that we're gonna do the work. Thank you.
That's so hard. I've almost given up on doing grants because like the bullshit that you have to wade through, it's all capitalist. Like Chris has called that out already. Like, and my nonprofit is just barely over a year old, and we almost all of our funding has come from providing consulting and professional development to educators. And I'm just to the point where I don't even want to deal, like even most of our grants that we've gotten so far have come from like the city of Seattle and from PESB. And there's just so many hoops to jump through for so little money. And I don't even know, like we have to decolonize nonprofit. We have to decolonize the nonprofit world, right? Like that's a whole nother conversation. I don't even know.
Totally. I had some recurring conversations with funders, and it's like the most frustrating people on the planet because they suffer from white savior syndrome so bad. Many folks of color within that conversation, but that white savior syndrome is so strong in funders, especially, right? And then I feel like the colonized notion of I can report to somebody else on what you're doing, so it makes me look good. So then it makes our funding agency look good. And it's like, well, is that the purpose? And yeah. So I feel like when we get funding from, I say we as collective community-based organizations get funding from Western institutions around the globe, the point is that's colonial money. You can sometimes do good with it, but it's not intended for you to do anything other than colonize, right? So that's why we have all these data systems. So it's just whether or not that's worth it. I love the idea, Tracy, of like doing workshops and doing other services that you're gifting essentially knowledge with other folks rather than, you know, in the colonial like matrix of funding. But that all requires extra hustle too, right? So it's a tireless like solution, meaning we end up exhausting the awesome people that we have doing that too.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I face as well. Like, you know, and what's frustrating as well, like if you show them honest data and they don't like it, they'll try to force you to change it. And you're like, but that's not the real thing. And so that's just something as a data person that you will struggle with all the time. And you're trying to like stay true, like showing reflective data kind of thing. And I know like for funding as well, like, you know, it's very difficult to find funding out there. And you always got to hustle or keep moving on and hoping that the next person will be nice kind of thing. I know in the Pacific Islander communities, that was something that we had trouble with as well. We were tired of begging people, we're tired of asking people. And so they decided to like form their own community and essentially like rally the entire community here to form like a dance group. They call it the Samoan Arts and Academic Competition, where they fundraise their own money to like support their own students kind of thing. And so I feel like that's an alternative, one of the many alternatives that could come up, like, coming up with your own sort of type of funding kind of thing. And so, yeah, I mean, it's not an easy question, and it's, we're still struggling with that as well too. But these are just some ways how I've seen the community deal with it too.
I love the community care. Like, I love that so much. Even like the Duwamish River Festival, I was looking at the sponsors, and we're a tiny nonprofit, brand new, and we donated at the top tier, right? And like Boeing donated at like 2 tiers lower than what we donated at. I'm like, you were the fuckers like ruining the river. Like, you should be putting billions of dollars into this. And there's a lot written about how nonprofit funders and nonprofit, the way the funding is structured allows capitalism to persist. Like, when we accept donations, we are absolving them of their accountability of paying like actual taxes and and doing their part, right? And so I often think about what it would look like to have almost like a nonprofit union, because they need us, right? The money they donate to us is tax deductible. So they need us just as much as we need them. They're not being altruistic. They're not doing it from the kindness of their heart. It's a money thing for them too, right? So yeah, I think that that's a totally different conversation, but one worth having.
And there was a question in the chat on if you can drop your definition of decolonization.
Is that to the panelists or to everyone?
I was about to ask the same question.
Okay. I mean, I can start with my own kind of thing. Like, I think for decolonizing myself, I think decolonization is like we mentioned before, it's an ongoing process. It's not something that we can totally get rid of, because, if someone, like if I found like a magic genie and then wished to be decolonized, like I'll be out without clothes, without money, without food, and I wouldn't know how to hunt and stuff like that back in the day. So when I think imagine decolonization, I think it's an ongoing process of decentralizing the colonial powers. Because I think the thing about colonization is that it forces you to think that there's only one way to do things. There's only one right way. There's only one correct way. There's only one power. But in an effort to decolonize, I feel like by showing them that there's power in different communities, there's different right answers. There's not just one, there's more than one answers. And I think that's how I get about, or how I imagine what decolonization is. And, and it's something that is always going, because like, I know Tracy and Chris mentioned this earlier, like the colonial powers will always resist as well. As much as we resist, the colonial powers will also resist. And that's why I emphasize that it's an ongoing process, because we can't just be complacent and we can't just like sit, because they will find sneaky ways to go around and do crazy shit. But yeah.
Well, I think that brings us to the time.
Yes. Thank you so much to our panelists once again, and thank you to everyone who was left on the call. And yeah, thank you so much, and we hope to see you at our next Lunch and Learn.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Beautiful.
Yeah, it's nice meeting you, Tracy and Chris.
Yeah,
Good to meet you.
Thank you.
Good combo.
Yes.
Y'all be well.
Too.
Take care.
You have the whole family on the call, Nestor.
Apparently.
I kept on messaging Teresa. I was like, do you know Adonna? Do you know Helen? Do you know this person? All right, see you later.
Take care.
Yeah, guys, thanks.
Bye.